Deborah thought she could turn my boat into her personal yacht club, but the Coast Guard and the courts proved otherwise. And if you think this story was wild, wait until you hear what happened when another HOA president tried to block a homeowner's driveway with her own car and ended up getting it towed live on camera. The boat and the hoe. There are moments when you realize just how deeply arrogance can sink into a neighborhood, how a few people, emboldened by rules and titles, believe they can own more than just houses and lawns. For me, that realization began not with fences or parking tickets, but with my boat. The boat had been my pride for years. Sleek, white-hulled, with a polished deck that gleamed in the sun, it wasn't just a vessel but a reminder of freedom. Every weekend, when the weather permitted, I'd take her out across the bay, the salt air in my lungs, the sound of water slapping against the hull. She wasn't the largest or flashiest craft at the marina, but she was mine, paid for, maintained with care, and secured in the slip I rented. The HOA, of course, had opinions about everything. They didn't control the marina directly, but many of the same board members lived in our neighborhood and treated every shared space as though it belonged solely to them. Rules were printed in endless newsletters, fines delivered for grass cut too long, shutters painted the wrong shade, or driveways with unsightly oil spots. Still, I kept to myself, never pushing back as long as they left me and my boat alone. But arrogance, left unchecked, always pushes further. The trouble began during a summer trip. I had taken time off work, planned a drive inland to visit family, and left the boat securely tied and locked. Before I left, I checked every latch, every line, and made sure the cabin was sealed. She sat safe in the marina, rocking gently, waiting for my return. At least, that's what I believed. What I didn't know was that the HOA, led by its ever-ambitious president, Deborah, a woman whose need for control seemed endless, had taken a particular interest in my boat. To her, it was more than a vessel. It was a status symbol, a trophy for the neighborhood to flaunt. And when I wasn't there to stop her, she decided it was hers to use. The first whispers came from neighbors who had passed by the marina. They mentioned music, lights, laughter, things that didn't belong to an empty dock. They assumed I had returned early, that I was hosting friends, but I wasn't there. I was hundreds of miles away, scrolling through family photos and oblivious to the fact that strangers were pouring drinks on my deck. Deborah, with her manicured nails and ironclad sense of entitlement, had orchestrated it. She had keys to nearly every gate, access codes to shared facilities, and an arrogance that told her no one would question her. So she boarded my boat, unlocked my cabin, and invited her friends. Wine flowed, music thundered, and laughter spilled across the bay as they turned my sanctuary into their playground. At first, it might have seemed harmless to them, a night of fun, a borrowed boat while the owner was gone. But arrogance always grows bolder with each unchecked indulgence. Soon, one night turned into two, and then into an entire weekend of parties. And then came the night that changed everything, with the cabin stuffed full of guests. With coolers packed and music echoing across the water, they cast off the lines. My boat was no longer sitting safely in her slip. Deborah and her guests piloted her into the bay, weaving through channels they didn't understand, steering with reckless hands. For them, it was freedom, glamour, a moment to pretend they owned something they did not. But for the bay, for the law, it was illegal. The Coast Guard patrol was routine that night, scanning for reckless craft, checking registrations, ensuring safety. And when they spotted my boat overloaded, weaving slightly, lights flashing from a speaker system not meant for the sea they moved in, their lights cut through the darkness, their sirens wailed, and Deborah's laughter froze in her throat. The Coast Guard doesn't tolerate joyrides. They pulled alongside, ordered the boat to idle, and demanded identification. Deborah, rattled but still clinging to her arrogance, stepped forward, insisting it was all under control. But it wasn't. She didn't know the registration details, couldn't answer basic questions, and had no right to be at the helm. My boat was impounded on the spot. Guests were escorted off, their party clothes dripping with seawater and shame. Deborah, for the first time in her reign of control, had no authority to wield, no clipboard to wave, no fines to issue. She was caught, exposed, and powerless. I didn't know it yet. I was still miles away, unaware that my property had been hijacked, that the Coast Guard had pulled her over, that my name was now tied to an incident report describing reckless endangerment. But the fallout was already beginning, and when I returned, I would walk into the storm of betrayal, arrogance, and consequences that Deborah had unleashed. And the moment I set foot back home, the HOA would realize they had crossed a line they could never come back from. The Discoverite drive back home was long but uneventful. I returned with the calm of someone who had spent time away, recharged and ready to slip back into routine. The neighborhood looked the same as I rolled in: trimmed lawns, shutters aligned, cars parked neatly according to HOA mandates. Nothing seemed out of place, but perfection often hides rot beneath the surface. It wasn't until I stopped at the marina that I noticed the first crack in the illusion. My boat's slip sat empty, the ropes dangling in the water like severed veins. For a moment, I thought I had parked in the wrong row, that perhaps my memory failed me. I walked the dock twice, scanning each space, heart pounding faster with each step. But she wasn't there. Panic set in. My boat, the vessel I had cared for, maintained, and secured, was gone. I felt the weight of every possibility. Had she been stolen? Had the marina staff moved her? Had something happened while I was away? I rushed to the harbor office, demanding answers. The manager's eyes held an uneasy sympathy. He slid a report across the counter, one that bore my name in the header but described a night I hadn't lived. It spoke of a Coast Guard stop, of reckless operation, of unauthorized passengers, and of the vessel being towed back to port under official custody. At first, I didn't believe it. The details blurred together, impossible to accept. My boat, the boat I had left securely locked, had been piloted into open water by strangers. She had been impounded. My name was tied to this madness. The more I read, the colder my blood ran. The impound paperwork included photographs. There she was, her deck littered with empty bottles, cushions askew, lights dangling from cords I hadn't installed. The images showed people I didn't recognize, but one face stood out. Deborah, the HOA president herself, stood on my deck, caught mid-gesture, pointing as though she were directing the entire fiasco, even in a grainy photo. Her smugness was unmistakable. She hadn't just borrowed my boat, she had claimed it as her own stage, her platform to flaunt power. Anger surged. I went straight to the impound lot, where my boat sat behind locked gates. She looked wounded, as though humiliated by the hands that had misused her. Scratches scarred the hull. The cabin window bore a crack I didn't leave inside. The smell of alcohol and salt water mixed with stale air, a far cry from the clean, polished sanctuary I had maintained. The Coast Guard officers I spoke with confirmed everything. The vessel had been overloaded, safety protocols ignored, life jackets tossed aside. The person at the helm hadn't even known how to operate her properly, if not for the patrol intercepting. When they did, she could have run aground or worse, capsized. But the part that twisted the knife deeper was the report's language. It identified me as the owner, but it listed the offense as if I were responsible. While the impound cleared my legal standing once I proved I hadn't been present, the stain remained. My boat's record now bore a scar, and by extension, so did mine. And all of it traced back to Deborah and her arrogance. When I finally returned home that evening, fury boiling just beneath the surface, the neighborhood looked different. It wasn't the lawns or the houses that had changed, it was the way people watched me. Eyes peeked from behind curtains. Whispers followed me from driveways. Some looked guilty, others amused, and a few avoided my gaze altogether. They knew, the HOA board, those who had cheered Deborah's antics for years, had likely been present at the party or had at least turned a blind eye. My absence had been their opportunity, and my property had become their playground. The betrayal cut deeper than any fine or petty rule enforcement. This wasn't about hedges or shutters. This was theft, plain and simple, and worse, it was humiliation. They hadn't just taken my boat, they had used it, flaunted it, and been caught in front of federal authorities. By the time I sat down in my living room, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was not going to pass quietly. The HOA had crossed a line. Deborah had crossed a line. and I was going to make sure they regretted every second they spent aboard my boat. The storm was coming, and this time, I wasn't the one unprepared. The confrontation's next HOA meeting was scheduled only a few days after I returned, and I knew it was my moment. Normally, these gatherings were dull affairs, discussions of law and ordinances, budget allocations, and endless arguments over mailbox colors. But this time, the air was different. Everyone knew what had happened at the marina. They just didn't know how I would respond. The clubhouse was already full when I arrived. The room buzzed with quiet whispers, neighbors shifting uncomfortably in their seats, eyes flicking toward me as though I carried the weight of scandal. On my shoulders, Deborah sat at the head of the long table, her ever-present clipboard in hand, lips pursed in the tight smile she wore when she believed she still held control. But her composure cracked the moment I walked in. I took my seat deliberately, dropping the Coast Guard report onto the table with a sound that echoed through the room. Pages spilled out photos of my boat mid-party, lists of infractions, evidence that could not be denied. The whispers in the room quieted instantly. Deborah's eyes flicked down, scanning the papers, and for a moment her expression faltered. But arrogance dies hard. She straightened, cleared her throat, and launched into the meeting as though nothing had happened. The charade didn't last long. I interrupted, my voice steady, and laid out the facts. My boat had been taken without permission. My property had been used for reckless parties. Federal authorities had been involved, and the person responsible was sitting at the head of the table, pretending nothing had happened. The silence that followed was suffocating. Neighbors shifted, glancing at each other, unwilling to speak, but desperate for someone else to break the tension. All eyes turned to Deborah. Her response was predictable. She tried to spin the narrative. She claimed it had been a community event, that she had only wanted to bring neighbors together, that no harm was intended. She even suggested that I should be grateful my boat had provided joy to the neighborhood. The words dripped with entitlement, as though she were the victim rather than the perpetrator. But the photographs told a different story. They showed her holding a wine glass, pointing from the helm as though she were in command. They showed guests dancing recklessly on the deck, bottles rolling on the floor, life jackets discarded in corners. There was no community spirit in those images, only indulgence and arrogance. The room began to shift. Murmurs rose, anger brewing among the homeowners, who realized they, too, could have been dragged into the fallout. The Coast Guard didn't just see my boat that night. They saw a neighborhood that tolerated this kind of behavior. Deborah's empire of fear and fines was cracking. Still, she fought back. She raised her voice, accused me of exaggerating, of trying to embarrass her. She claimed she had every right to borrow the boat, since it belonged to a resident of the community. That line was her fatal mistake. The words hung in the air like poison, and the reaction was immediate. Neighbors gasped, eyes widening. At her brazen admission, the illusion of leadership shattered. She wasn't protecting the neighborhood. She was exploiting it. By the time the meeting ended, Deborah was red-faced and defensive, the once loyal board members avoiding her gaze. The crowd filed out in uneasy silence, but I could see the shift. For the first time, Deborah had been forced into a corner, her power slipping. As I walked home that night, the rage inside me had cooled into something sharper, resolve. Confronting her at the meeting was only the first step. The HOA wasn't going to simply apologize and walk away. They had dragged my name into Coast Guard records, damaged my property, and humiliated me in front of the community. I wasn't finished. I was just getting started. The next stage wouldn't happen in a meeting room. It would happen in offices, in courts, and in every place where Deborah thought her power could shield her. The HOA had crossed into theft and endangerment, and now it was my turn to make sure they faced the consequences. The confrontation was over, but the war was just beginning. The Duluth morning after the meeting, the neighborhood hummed with whispers. In driveways, on porches, at the mailboxes where residents lingered, the story spread like wildfire. Everyone had known Deborah could be controlling, but few had realized just how far she would go. Now, her arrogance had been laid bare, captured in photographs and official reports stamped with the authority of the Coast Guard. The fallout began immediately. First came the insurance companies. Word of the incident had reached them before I even filed my own claims. Representatives showed up, notepad in hand, documenting the scratches along the hull, the cracked cabin window, and the water damage inside. They shook their heads, explaining what I already knew. Repairs would be costly and liability was murky. Since the HOA president herself had been at the helm, they hinted the association could be held financially responsible. That suggestion alone sent shockwaves through the community. If the HOA's insurance was forced to cover the damage, every homeowner's dues would skyrocket. Neighbors who had once turned a blind eye to Deborah's antics now saw her as a financial threat. Her arrogance wasn't just an annoyance anymore, it was reaching directly into their wallets. Then came the Coast Guard's follow-up. They weren't interested in my absence anymore. I had cleared that hurdle, but their report, once filed, didn't simply disappear. It triggered inquiries into boating safety violations, potential charges for operating without authorization, and reckless endangerment. And because Deborah had used her title as HOA president to access the marina, the line between individual action and organizational liability blurred. The HOA was now entangled in an investigation they never expected. Deborah, for all her bluster, began to falter. She tried to call emergency board meetings to rally her loyalists, but the room was half empty. The very people who had once bowed to her authority now questioned whether their allegiance was worth the fines and humiliation. One board member resigned outright, leaving a public statement taped to his front door that simply read, "I will not be party to this madness." The neighborhood, once cowed by Deborah's iron grip, was beginning to fracture, but the most satisfying part of the fallout wasn't in the courtrooms or the boardrooms. It was in the day-to-day interactions. Deborah, who had once strutted through the streets with her clipboard and sharp tongue, now avoided eye contact. Her morning walks had stopped. The smug smile was gone. Neighbors who had once feared her fines now muttered insults when she passed. The empire she had built on intimidation was crumbling. Still, I knew this wasn't enough. The HOA had caused me tangible harm, damage to my property, stress and humiliation. A mere shift in social standing wouldn't balance the scales. So I began gathering everything: photographs, receipts, official reports, witness statements from neighbors who had seen the parties. Every piece of evidence stacked higher, a fortress of proof that would stand unshakable in front of any judge. The legal battle began quietly. A letter drafted by my attorney landed on the HOA's desk, demanding accountability. It wasn't just about repairs, it was about negligence, unauthorized use of property, and the reckless endangerment of lives. The letter made it clear, either they settled or they would face me in court. That letter spread panic faster than any rumor. Homeowners realized the HOA's funds, their funds could be drained in lawsuits. Whispers turned into arguments. Driveways became battlefields of shouted accusations. Some demanded Deborah resign immediately. Others tried to defend her, but their voices were drowned out by anger. The once pristine neighborhood was now a powder keg, lit by Deborah's arrogance. And through it all, I remained steady. I didn't need to yell in the street or engage in their bickering. The evidence spoke for itself, and I knew the weight of the truth would crush them eventually. By the end of the month, Deborah was isolated. The board fractured, homeowners restless, the HOA teetered on collapse. But I also knew desperate people make reckless choices, and Deborah, cornered and clinging to her last threads of power, was not finished yet. The fallout had weakened her, but it hadn't destroyed her. And I suspected she was about to make one final, desperate move, a mistake that would seal her fate for good. Deborah's desperation. Deborah was many things: controlling, arrogant, entitled, but above all, she was incapable of admitting defeat. Even as her reputation crumbled, even as neighbors turned against her, she clung to the illusion of power like a drowning woman grasping at driftwood. And desperation in her hands was dangerous. At first, she tried charm. She went door to door with carefully rehearsed apologies, insisting the entire boating incident had been a misunderstanding. She told residents she had permission, that the Coast Guard report had been exaggerated, that I was overreacting. Some listened politely, but most closed their doors in her face. The neighborhood no longer feared her clipboard or her threats. Her words once gospel, were now little more than noise. When charm failed, she turned to intimidation. Letters began appearing in mailboxes and signed, but written in the same clipped, officious tone Deborah always used. They warned of severe consequences if residents spoke against the HOA or provided testimony on my behalf. Some neighbors laughed at the letters, others felt a chill reading them. But everyone knew where they came from. The more she tried to scare people, the more isolated she became, and then she grew reckless. In a last-ditch attempt to rewrite the narrative, Deborah called an emergency HOA meeting. The invitation was plastered across the neighborhood bulletin board in bold letters, demanding mandatory attendance. Her plan was obvious: seize control of the story before the lawsuit consumed her. I went, not because I expected reason, but because I wanted to see her unravel with my own eyes. The clubhouse was packed, every seat filled, neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder. The air buzzed with tension. Deborah stood at the front, dressed in her usual sharp suit, clipboard clutched tight like a shield. But the confidence she once radiated had dulled into something brittle. She launched into her speech with fire. She accused me of betrayal, of trying to destroy the community for personal gain. Claiming she had only ever acted in the neighborhood's best interest, she waved her clipboard, shouting about loyalty and unity, about how the residents should rally behind her against outside forces. But her words landed flat. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, then sharper whispers, then outright laughter. Neighbors shook their heads, arms crossed, unwilling to be manipulated again. Some shouted back, calling her a liar, reminding her of the photographs, the Coast Guard report, the fines she had unfairly issued for years. The room turned against her in real time, her empire collapsing around her dot, and then she snapped. Her voice rose to a shriek, her face red as she screamed about ungrateful neighbors, about traitors and conspirators. She slammed her clipboard on the table, papers scattering across the floor. Every ounce of composure dissolved into rage. And in that moment, the last of her credibility burned away. That meeting ended in chaos. Homeowners stormed out, some tearing up their dues checks on the spot. Others gathered in clusters, vowing to call their attorneys, to push for dissolution of the HOA entirely. Deborah was left standing alone in the wreckage, her words echoing in an empty hall, her clipboard abandoned on the floor like the crown of a dethroned monarch. But desperation doesn't fade quietly. Over the next few days, Deborah grew erratic. She patrolled the streets late at night, peering into driveways, scribbling notes no one cared about. She shouted at children for riding bikes too close to her yard. She cornered neighbors in grocery store aisles, ranting about betrayal. What little respect remained dissolved into pity, then into scorn, and finally, she made her greatest mistake of all. She tried to retaliate against me directly. One evening, I returned to the marina to check on my boat, only to find Deborah there, standing on the dock, fiddling with the lock on my cabin door. She jumped back when she saw me, stammering excuses, but the image was seared into my mind. Even after everything, she still thought she could claim what wasn't hers. That was the final piece of evidence I needed. Witnesses had seen her. Security cameras had recorded her. It was no longer just arrogance or recklessness, it was attempted trespass, caught in the act. The lawsuit, once a looming threat, became a certainty she couldn't escape. The evidence was stacked to high, her allies to few, her power completely gone. Deborah had played every card: charm, intimidation, rage, and lost them all. What remained was only the inevitable end. And when the reckoning came, it would not just dismantle her reign, it would shatter the HOA she had ruled like a kingdom. The reckoningth day of reckoning didn't come with a bang, it came with paperwork. Court summonses were issued, lawyers exchanged thick packets of evidence, and Deborah's name appeared in black ink beside a list of accusations: trespassing, unauthorized use of property, negligence, reckless endangerment. The HOA itself, too, was named in the lawsuit. It wasn't just Deborah standing trial, it was the entire organization she had built and ruled with an iron fist. Inside the courtroom, the story unfolded piece by piece. The Coast Guard's report was presented first, a detailed account of the violations committed the night she commandeered my boat. The officer's words were clear, the photographs sharper still. Deborah's voice could be heard in recordings, attempting to justify her actions with flimsy excuses about community use. The jury didn't need imagination evidence. Spoke plainly. Then came the financial records, my repair bills, receipts for cleaning up after the so-called party, expert testimony about the damage done. The costs weren't just numbers, they were a tangible reminder of what her arrogance had inflicted. Witnesses followed. Neighbors who had seen her host gatherings on the deck of my boat, who had watched her hand out drinks as though she were the owner. Others who testified to her intimidation tactics, the unsigned letters, the threats. Each statement chipped away at the crumbling facade she clung to. Deborah tried to defend herself, but her words were hollow. She blamed me. She blamed the coast guard. She blamed the neighbors who had turned on her. She claimed it was all a smear campaign designed to destroy her leadership. But every time she opened her mouth, her credibility shrank. Even the judge, usually expressionless, seemed weary of her outbursts. When the verdict came, it was swift and merciless. Deborah was found personally liable for trespassing and reckless endangerment. The HOA was ordered to pay restitution for the damage to my boat and to cover my legal fees. The association's funds, already stretched thin, buckled under the weight of the judgment. Dues skyrocketed overnight, sparking outrage. Homeowners, already fed up, voted to dissolve the HOA entirely rather than continue funding a sinking ship. Deborah's kingdom was gone. She lost her position, her influence, and her reputation. Once the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, she was now just another resident, her clipboard gathering dust in some forgotten drawer. The same neighbors who had once feared her now ignored her entirely, treating her as if she were invisible. For me, the victory was more than financial. Yes, the repairs were covered, the damage undone, but it was the principle that mattered most. The message had been delivered clearly. My property was mine, not the HOA's, not Deborah's. And anyone who thought otherwise would face the consequences. Life at the marina returned to peace. My boat, restored and gleaming, floated calmly in the slip where it belonged. The laughter of Deborah's unauthorized guests was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of the water against the hull. The community, free from her tyranny, began to rebuild its sense of normalcy. Neighbors who had once whispered in fear now greeted one another openly, no longer under the shadow of constant surveillance and fines. As for Deborah, her fall became a cautionary tale. Other HOA letters in nearby communities whispered about what had happened, using her name as an example of how power could corrode judgment. She was no longer a leader, no longer feared, only remembered as the woman who overreached, who thought she could take what wasn't hers, and who paid the price for it. The reckoning had come, and with it, balance was restored. And as I stood on the deck of my boat one evening, watching the sun dip low over the horizon, I couldn't help but think it hadn't just been about a party or even a boat. It had been about boundaries, respect, and the line between authority and arrogance. Deborah had crossed that line, and in the end, the current had swept her away.